The United States of America elects its next president on the first Tuesday of November every 4 years. Ensuring a peaceful transition is tantamount, as the next commander-in-chief needs to be ready to take the reins on day one. Abraham Lincoln became our nation's 16th president in November of 1860. His 4 months between election to the nation's highest office and his inauguration were 4 of the longest in American history. Although the former representative from Illinois assured Southerners that he had no immediate intention of eliminating slavery, South Carolina organized a statewide convention that voted unanimously to dissolve the Union. Although the move was shocking, there were many who weren't surprised, as South Carolina had become home to a group of radical pro-slavery Democrats who had long advocated for secession from the United States. It had been their violent rhetoric which had convinced the Southern Democrats to run their own third-party candidate against Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Other Southern states followed, with Mississippi enacting a secession ordinance, followed by Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana in January. The timing mattered, as James Buchanan's term was coming to an end, and the lame duck president hesitated to take firm action, choosing instead to deny the legal right of states to secede, while simultaneously proclaiming that the federal government couldn't legally prevent them from seceding. It was only after several cabinet members resigned in protest that he sent additional federal troops into the belly of the beast, fortifying Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The Civil War had now become inevitable. You're listening to A Push Through History, a resource designed for students completing the course of AP US History. This episode covers the second portion of Period 5, 1848 to 1877, the Civil War. Texas was the next to secede, despite warnings from Unionist governor and Mexican War hero Sam Houston, who predicted that the North would overwhelm the South. In February, still 2 months before Abraham Lincoln could emerge off the sidelines, the rebellious states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to officially create the Confederate States of America, complete with a provisional constitution which enshrined the right to slavery, as well as appointing as president Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator. His prior experience as Secretary of War was viewed as critical if Lincoln insisted on a more aggressive course than his predecessor. Alexander Stephens was elected as vice president. It was Stephens who delivered the cornerstone speech, making it clear to everyone that slavery was the South's primary reason for seceding. Although there were fewer slaves in Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, these states would later join the Confederacy in its rebellion. Each of their elected congressmen, except for Tennessee's Andrew Johnson, would pack up their belongings and depart Washington, D.C., for the new Confederacy capital established in Richmond, Virginia. The border states, as they came to be known, however, decided to remain loyal to the Union. In each of the 4 states, slavery was practiced, but yeoman farmers held more political power and thus were able to prevent more radical action. Journalist Hilton Helper was one of the most popular writers in this region, regularly pointing out to his readers that all too often the slaveholders have hoodwinked you. Buchanan's last-ditch effort to avert conflict came in the form of the Crittenden Compromise, put forth by Kentucky Senator John Crittenden. It consisted of 2 parts. First, a constitutional amendment to protect slavery from federal interference in any state where it already existed. Secondly, an extension of the old Missouri Compromise line all the way to the California border. Such action would have likely been acceptable to the South, but the Republican delegation in Congress rejected it unanimously under strict instructions from President-elect Abraham Lincoln. Although he was an abolitionist at heart, Lincoln's rejection of the compromise stemmed from an understanding that such a compromise would merely kick the can down the road, as slaveholders had regularly discussed conquering Cuba, Mexico, and other portions of Latin America in order to spread the institution of slavery. Finally, on March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as President of the United States. Faced with the two seemingly insurmountable issues of slavery and secession, the president chose to take on the latter first. In his address, he promised to safeguard slavery where it currently existed, but vowed to prevent its further expansion. Such action was necessary to prevent the four border states from joining the Confederacy. Had Lincoln issued an Emancipation Proclamation at this point, the war against the South would have been far more difficult and perhaps impossible. He made it clear, however, that in his viewpoint, secession was illegal, as the Union of the United States was perpetual. Like Andrew Jackson had during the nullification crisis of 1828, he believed that he had the right as commander-in-chief to utilize military force to preserve federal control over the states. He finished his speech with a promise to hold, occupy, and possess all federal property in the seceded states, as well as to collect all taxes from such areas. 1 month later, the first shots at Fort Sumter, a federal military installation in South Carolina, were fired. Jefferson Davis had decided to seize the fort, which Lincoln had instructed its defenders to not give an inch, but to be sure that they weren't the ones who fired first. After 2 days of bombardment, the federal forces had no choice but to surrender. The first victory of the war belonged to the South. Such an attack was necessary for Lincoln to rally support for a military draft in the North. 2 days after Sumter fell, he called up 75,000 state militiamen into federal service for 90 days in order to put down what he referred to as an insurrection too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. The action was popular, with Ohio, the former home of abolitionist John Brown, sending 7 extra regiments beyond the 13 that had been requested. Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democratic presidential candidate who had previously advocated for the continuation of slavery in the South, made it clear that every man must be for the United States or against it. There can be no neutrals in this war, only patriots or traitors. As I mentioned earlier, the 8 states in the middle of the nation were the key to the South's chances during the war. At the moment, only the Deep South had seceded. They desperately pressured their fellow slave states to join them, as the Middle states contained 2/3 of the white population of the slaveholding states, as well as 3/4 of their industrial production and well over half of the food-supplying fields. Each of those resources would be critical in the defensive war that the South had planned for. The secessionists believed that they could pull from the playbook of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 to slowly bleed the North, death by 1,000 paper cuts. In their minds, they only needed to show that they were willing to defend their way of life, and eventually the North would leave them to it. Virginia was the first to relent to the pressure after a state convention reached an 88-55 decision on April 17, 1861, to secede from the Union. It was a quick process, done just 4 days after the Confederacy attack on Fort Sumter. Incredibly, Robert E. Lee, a hero of the U.S.-Mexico War and a man who had already been tapped to lead the Union forces against the Confederacy, immediately resigned his federal command. He made it clear that he was putting his state ahead of his country, proclaiming that save in defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword. While it is clear that Lee's main justification was his love of state, it needs to be put to the record that the general was a slave master, inheriting at least 3 or 4 families, which he drove particularly hard in order to draw his family out of debt. There are multiple accounts of Lee encouraging his overseers to violently punish his slaves when an infraction was noted. I point this out in part because Lee is at the center of a number of controversies involving Confederate statues, a process that began with the placement of the statues in the 1980s. Lee's supporters rightfully point out that he is an incredible military commander, one of the very best that the United States has ever produced. Ignoring the possibility that slavery was at part of the reason for Lee's decision makes it easier for individuals to glorify Lee's actions, which were done on behalf of the Confederacy. But as Douglas intimated, in this war there are only 2 sides, patriots and traitors. Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina all joined Virginia in seceding, bringing the Confederacy to a total of 11 states. Surprisingly, the western province of Virginia suffered an internal revolt, which culminated 2 years later in the state of West Virginia forming and joining the Union. The North scored another victory in keeping Delaware, which had slaves, but the other border states proved trickier. Slave owners in Maryland attacked a squadron of Massachusetts troops, which were traveling through Baltimore. 4 soldiers and 12 civilians were killed, marking the first deaths of the conflict. From there, a violent street war for the loyalty of Maryland commenced, with secessionists destroying railroad bridges and telegraph lines, while Lincoln's troops occupied the State House and used their power under martial law to arrest sympathizers, including state legislators. Believing firmly that a house divided cannot stand, Lincoln would regularly arrest individuals whom he believed hindered the war effort, putting the Union over all else. This included an act in 1864, which commanded Major General John Dix to take over the publishing centers for the New York World and New York Journal of Commerce for printing false and spurious proclamations that were designed to give aid and comfort to the enemies of the United States. In Maryland, a group of mobilized German-American militiamen, a group who notoriously despised the practice of slavery, defeated a force of Confederate sympathizers that were led by the state's governor. Although the state remained in the Union for the duration of the war, federal forces were continually bogged down in the border state as Confederate guerrilla groups like the Quantrill Raiders operated throughout the war. That particular raider group featured Jesse James, a slaveholder who would go on to rob dozens of banks in the West using the tactics which he developed during the Civil War. Kentucky was the last of the border states to make its decision. Owing to their importance along the Ohio River, Lincoln allowed Kentucky to continue to trade with the Confederacy for the first 4 months of the war. His decision to end the practice resulted in the state being invaded by the Confederacy, only to be driven off by a group of Illinois volunteers led by Ulysses S. Grant. His fame would be firmly established during the war, propelling him all the way to the presidency. But for now, the Northern War efforts were in the less than capable hands of George McClellan, a man known as Little Napoleon. Unfortunately, at this point in time, McClellan had ordered his men to halt far more than to fight. He regularly blamed the weather, his subordinate officers, faulty intelligence, as well as the incompetence of Lincoln himself to excuse his failure to act. During the Peninsular Campaign of 1862, he spent weeks trying to figure out how the Confederacy had managed to obtain 300 artillery pieces to ring the capital of Richmond, only to later realize that the cannons were mere logs which had been painted black, a form of Quaker guns, harmless props designed to appear like actual weapons. Short on manpower, industry, and food, the South desired a defensive war, one that would sap the strength of the Union while displaying their steadfast resolve to defend their rights. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, claimed that like their revolutionary grandfathers, white Southerners were fighting for the sacred right of self-government. They sought no conquest, he said, no aggrandizement. All we ask is to be left alone. The North had to figure out how to defeat their opponent while keeping open the door to a reunion. They settled upon a three-tiered plan known as the Anaconda Plan. The hope was to strangle the South, squeezing them to such a degree that the South would come crawling back to the Union. The plan called for a blockade of all Southern ports, particularly cutting them off from England, who had been caught red-handed negotiating with the South during the Trent Affair. Secondly, a decisive strike along the Mississippi River would carve the South in two, splitting off Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Finally, Lincoln's war plans called for the quick capture of Richmond, Virginia, the Confederacy's capital. There were plenty in the North who believed that the war would be a breeze, with one New York volunteer loudly proclaiming, "What a picnic, to go down south for 3 months and clean up the whole business." The issue of a splendid little war collapsed at Bull Run, when 30,000 Union troops were routed by General Beauregard's force of just 20,000 at the Virginia rail junction of Manassas. It was the first time that the so-called rebel yell was heard on the battlefield, with one Union veteran writing of the peculiar corkscrew sensation that the rebel yell sends down your backbone can never be told. Still confused at the events of the past year, audience members came to watch the battle unfold in real time. At the end of the production, the audience was delighted to see the Union forced to retreat. The general in charge of the defeat was replaced by the previously mentioned McClellan. Immediately alerted to the challenges faced by the Union Army of the Potomac, Lincoln enlisted another 1,000,000 men to serve for 3 years. The rest of 1861 would be spent by the overly cautious McClellan training his new men. The president grew so impatient that he eventually commented that if McClellan isn't going to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time. Finally, in March of 1862, the Union launched its major offensive along the peninsula between the York and James rivers that make up the Chesapeake Bay. Because he refused to move quickly, the Confederates were able to develop a counter-strike, with Stonewall Jackson marching through the Shenandoah Valley of Western Virginia in order to threaten Washington, D.C. This forced Lincoln to recall 1/3 of McClellan's troops, allowing Robert E. Lee to launch a 6-day attack against the Union's weakened forces. The Confederates got worse than they gave, but McClellan's cautiousness allowed Lee to live to fight another day, depriving Lincoln of the decisive victory that he believed would end the war. The two generals next faced each other at Antietam, which would prove to be the bloodiest day in American history. After routing the Union at the Second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862, Lee sent Stonewall Jackson to capture the military base of Harper's Ferry. Incredibly, the war plans were found by Union forces in a cigar case that had been dropped. Despite knowing of the enemy's setup, McClellan yet again hesitated, allowing the South to establish a defensive position at Antietam, a creek in Maryland. The Southern forces were outnumbered 87,000 to 50,000, a sizable difference of 37,000 fighting men. The advantages proved to be enough, but rather than pursuing the retreating Lee, McClellan refused to chase after his opponent, allowing him to yet again live to fight another day. For Lincoln, Antietam was the final straw. He fired McClellan, creating a powerful political enemy, one who would go on to run against the president in the election of 1864. Ambrose Burnside, a general who remains most known for his trendy facial hair, suggests that neither commander was capable of getting the job done. 6 months after being promoted to the head job, Burnside and his sideburns resigned after suffering heavy losses in Fredericksburg, Maryland. He was replaced by Fighting Joe Hooker, a man who never lived up to the moniker. Meanwhile, fighting in the central portion of the nation, an area known as the Western Front due to the fact that the actual American West had yet to be populated, was heating up. This was the portion of the Anaconda Plan that called for a strike along the Mississippi River in order to carve the Confederacy in two. Ulysses S. Grant was experiencing some success, as his riverboats, clad with iron plates, took control of the Tennessee and Mississippi rivers. The two most famous ironclads, as they were known, were the Merrimac and the Monitor, which regularly fought to a standstill as their iron armor proved to be invincible against the cannons of the day. Grant, however, was surprised at Shiloh, Tennessee, resulting in a battlefield that was, in his words, so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk over the clearing in any direction, stepping on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground. Although Grant was accused of being unprepared and drunk at the outset of the conflict, Lincoln waved away the complaints, proclaiming that he couldn't spare a man who fights. Indeed, Grant's so-called victory at Shiloh was only because he was willing to relentlessly commit troops against the entrenched Confederate forces. He was soon promoted to replace Joseph Hooker, a man whose biggest accomplishment in the war was to have such a large camp following of wives, daughters, and girlfriends that the nickname of Hooker's Army would go on to attach itself to the world's oldest profession. After Shiloh, Grant claimed that he gave up all ideas of saving the Union except by complete conquest. Lincoln seemed to agree with him, eventually granting him the ability to conduct total warfare, meaning that Grant was allowed to destroy the South in order to save it. From this point on, anything that targeted the South's economy, political institutions, and culture were fair game. 3 weeks after Shiloh, the Union had taken over New Orleans, the South's financial center and largest city. From this point onward, the western portion of the Confederacy was merely an afterthought. It was far easier for the North to mobilize its resources against the South. They had a significantly larger population, access to national and international banks, far more industry, as well as railroad tracks to resupply the troops. And they were also fighting for two causes: the preservation of the Union and an unofficial fight against slavery. While Southerners initially joined up in larger numbers due in part to the South's strong military tradition and culture that stressed duty and honor, many eligible men were unwilling to leave their homes in fear of a potential Nat Turner-styled slave rebellion that would result in the deaths of their loved ones. Keep in mind that the majority of Southern citizens didn't own slaves, meaning that they didn't economically gain anything from the practice. As family members failed to come home from battle, the price for defending the abhorrent practice was becoming too much to bear for a number of the Confederacy's citizens. The South began to draft its citizens after Shiloh, creating the first legally binding draft in American history. It would last for the remainder of the war, obligating 3 years of military service for all men aged 18 to 35. There were a few exemptions, as a wealthy man could fire a substitute, and any slaveholder was entitled to retain 1 white man for every 20 slaves on their plantation. Thus, the men that created the circumstances that caused the Civil War didn't actually fight in the war. It was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Still, some Southerners refused to leave their farms in duty to their new nation. They were protected by the Southern-held belief in states' rights, as numerous state judges issued writs of habeas corpus to protect their draft dodgers from arbitrary arrest for failing to comply. As had been true during the period of time beneath the Articles of Confederation, a nation which lacked a strong central government struggled to survive. The North didn't have such problems, with Lincoln's government imprisoning about 15,000 Southern sympathizers without trial, and draft dodgers were confronted by a quick and efficient military tribunal rather than sympathetic juries of their peers. Like in the South, Northerners could buy their way out of the draft, but recruiters found the cash bounties were effective in luring men to the front. 1863 became a turning point, however, as the Enrollment Act of 1863 initiated protests by Irish and German immigrants who refused to serve in the war that wasn't of their own making. These recent immigrants had come in search of economic opportunities in Northern war factories and fell for an argument pushed by a Democratic newspaper in Cincinnati that Lincoln was drafting poor whites in order to liberate enslaved blacks, who would then flood to northern cities in order to take their jobs. Race riots spread to New York as Irish and German workers burned down the city's draft offices and attacked the police. More than a dozen African Americans were lynched, while hundreds of black families were forced to flee from their homes. Proving that their outrage had no moral boundary, they even burned down the city's colored orphan asylum. The damage was so pervasive that President Lincoln was forced to withdraw some troops who had just fought at Gettysburg in order to suppress the riots which killed more than 100 New Yorkers. Despite the riots, support for Lincoln's war remained high. New York led the way in establishing the U.S. Sanctuary Commission, which coordinated clothing donations and medical supplies. Dorothea Dix became the superintendent of female nurses, opening up new pathways for women as thousands became government clerks, school and factory workers, as well as government spies and scouts. A few brave women even went undercover, posing as men in order to join the front lines. Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield during the Civil War, would go on to say that by the war's end, women were at least 50 years in advance of the normal position which continued peace would have assigned her. Barton would go on to create the Red Cross after the fighting was over. The North was far better able to leverage its economic advantages in comparison to the South, a fact shown by the detail that Union spending went from $63 million in 1860 to an incredible $865 million 4 years later. This neo-mercantilism program of government-assisted economic development exceeded the level of interference that Henry Clay's American system had imposed 2 decades prior. High tariffs were placed on foreign goods in order to encourage domestic consumption. The Homestead Act of 1862 boosted agricultural output by offering up 160 acres of free land on the condition that the settlers remained there for at least 5 years and improved the land. The North also created an integrated modern national banking system after the Secretary of Treasury, Salmon Chase, forced thousands of local banks to accept federal regulations. The government dealt with the costs of war through 3 methods. First, they increased taxes on products as well as direct taxes on corporations, inheritances, and the wealthy. Secondly, they issued interest-paying bonds, which were purchased by more than 1 million Northern families. Third, they printed $150 million under the Legal Tender Act of 1862. Incredibly, these greenbacks weren't able to be exchanged for official specie of gold or silver, speeding up the transition to paper currency. Henry Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, wrote that little by little one began to feel that behind the chaos in Washington, power was taking shape, that it was massed and guided as it had not been before. There was no such mobilization among the Confederacy, which held on to its steadfast belief in the importance of states' rights. 60% of their spending was financed by printing paper money, which resulted in absurdly high rates of inflation. They refused to purchase war bonds for fear that they were on the losing side of the conflict. And after South Carolina storekeeper Jim Harris refused to accept Confederate dollars, his storehouse was robbed of more than $5,000 worth of goods by Southern soldiers. Historian James Henrietta explains the ramifications for us, writing that facing a public that feared strong government and high taxation, the Confederacy could sustain the war effort only by seizing its citizens' property and by championing white supremacy. President Davis warned that a Union victory would destroy slavery and reduce the whites to the degraded position of the African race. (1863) would prove to be the turning point for the war. Lincoln began a New Year celebrations by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves within states that had seceded. At this point, he remained concerned that the border states would still turn against him. He had teased such a decision 6 months earlier, publicly linking black freedom with the preservation of the Union. Still, his actions remained purely practical in nature, as he told those who listened, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." As the Union penetrated further into the South, slaves began to escape behind enemy lines. After Union General Benjamin Butler deemed the runaways as contraband, or enemy property that can be legitimately seized during war, the emancipation of the unjustly incarcerated began in earnest. By the war's end, there were more than 400,000 black refugees, a full-fledged humanitarian crisis. Soon, emancipation was leveraged as an instrument of war, weakening the enemy while strengthening their own hand by offering the opportunity to enlist in the Army of the Potomac. To their disappointment, blacks that enlisted were forced into manual labor jobs at reduced pay compared to their white peers. Despite the secondary nature of their integration, white voters quickly led a political backlash against the shifting of war aims, with Democrat Horatio Seymour achieving the governorship of New York on an anti-abolitionist message. Democrats also saw victories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois, but remained a distant minority to the Republicans in both chambers of Congress. Still, Lincoln pressed on, telling his biographers that if his name ever goes into history, it would be for the Emancipation Proclamation. It was at this critical political junction that U.S. Grant split the Confederacy in two and altered the war's nature to one of total warfare. His siege at Vicksburg took 6 long weeks, but broke through the national malaise as the starving garrison happened to have surrendered on July 4th. The victory was so complete that the South was divided on how to respond. Jefferson Davis hoped to send an army to Tennessee to relieve the pressure and regain control of the Mississippi. But General Lee convinced him to instead change the nature of the war by invading the North through Pennsylvania. The battle that followed wasn't planned by either side, with Confederate forces stepping into the small town of Gettysburg in search for pairs of shoes. George Meade had replaced Fightin' Joe Hooker as head of the army just days prior to the conflict, and on July 1st engaged the enemy upon northern land. On the first day of the battle, Lee drove the Union's advance guard to the south of the town, forcing the newly crowned Union general to take up a position on a defensible hilltop. After reinforcements arrived overnight, Meade attempted to bully the South with his significantly larger forces. Not only did this not happen, but there were multiple times where Lee almost managed to turn the Union's flanks. The third day, however, proved to be decisive, after Southern General George Pickett's 14,000 men failed to charge up the Cemetery Ridge. Half of the men in his division didn't survive the mile of open terrain against the Union's established artillery and massed riflemen. When the smoke cleared, the Confederacy had lost the ability to ever threaten the North. From this point on, a defensive war was their only possible path to victory. Meade, having to deal with his own casualties, had committed the cardinal sin of refusing to hunt down Lee, resulting in the baton being passed yet again, this time to Ulysses S. Grant, the man who fights. Black men continued to flock to the Union banner after the victory, with civil rights leader Frederick Douglass, a wartime advisor to the president, pointing out that black citizens in the North wanted to, quote, earn their citizenship. Their role increased after the glorious sacrifice of the 54th Massachusetts, a black regiment governed by white officers. Their courageous assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina finally convinced Union officers of the value that black soldiers brought to the North. Those that figured it out benefited immensely. Harriet Tubman, an early conductor of the Underground Railroad, continued to infiltrate the South, alerting slaves of the possibility of freedom as the Union forces passed through. Her actions earned her the respect of Major General David Hunter, who after one particular raid was seen fetching a pitcher of water, merely standing there waiting with it in his hand while a black woman drank. The soldier that captured the moment in his diary described the scene as though the Major General was the servant to this incredible black woman, a woman whom many would go on to label as the Moses of the Underground Railroad. By the end of the war, Lincoln had recruited and armed nearly 200,000 African Americans, proclaiming that without black soldiers, we would be compelled to abandon the war in just 3 weeks. With Grant finally in control of the war, 1864 was dominated by two major actions. Grant took the harder of the two paths, challenging his fellow veteran of the Mexican War to a series of battles across Virginia. Knowing that he had more men to lose, Grant was willing to accept huge losses, while Lee remained defensive. The actions during this period earned Grant the reputation of a butcher, of the enemy, and of his own men. Gradually, the North wore down Lee, who lost 31,000 across the series of running battles. But the 55,000 casualties counted among Grant's forces put Lincoln's re-election hopes in jeopardy. In order to shore up electoral support, Lincoln named Andrew Johnson as his running mate. Johnson, a slave owner himself, had been the only senator from a southern state who had remained loyal to D.C. The Republican Party initially splintered, with a group known as the Radical Republicans nominating Californian John Fremont. Soon afterwards, however, Fremont ended his presidential bid by endorsing Lincoln. The War Democrats, the portion of the Democratic Party that supported the war against the South, were instrumental in re-electing Lincoln. But Johnson's inclusion was instrumental in their decision to renominate the sitting president of the Republican Party. McClellan, Lincoln's first failed general, picked up the Democratic Copperheads vote, a group which signaled a willingness to end the war without total victory. They expected that McClellan's past life as a popular military commander would endear him to the soldiers, a voting bloc that was instrumental in sending Lincoln back to the White House for 4 more years. But after a series of good news in 1864, Lincoln's slogan of "Don't change horses in the middle of the stream" saw him re-elected with 55% of the popular vote, losing just 3 Union states. 75% of the soldiers' vote all went Lincoln's way. Grant continued his war with ruthless measures, telling General Sheridan to scorch the earth near Pennsylvania, destroying grains, barns, and grist mills that could be used to aid the enemy. He then ordered General Sherman to take Atlanta. His 90,000 men methodically marched towards the railway hub of the Confederacy, burning everything along the way. Aflush with the good news from the battlefield and the electoral box, Republicans pushed through the 13th Amendment, officially ending slavery in January of 1865. 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had declared all slaves in rebellious states free. Only stopping to rest in Atlanta, Sherman next proposed a march to the sea, one that would be, quote, "a demonstration to the world, foreign and domestic, that we have a power Jefferson Davis cannot resist." Incredibly, Sherman himself was a Southerner, showcasing how this war pitted brothers against each other. The general knew that such an outcome was possible at the outset of the war, when he told his Southern friends that if war comes, I must fight people whom I best love. He also said that we are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor feel the hard hand of war. His march to the sea lasted for 300 miles, ending at Savannah, Georgia, a city which Sherman claimed was too beautiful to burn. A Union veteran described the march by writing that we destroyed all we could not eat, stole their slaves, burned their cottons and gin, spilled their sorghum, burned and twisted their railroads, and raised hell generally. The campaign was so demoralizing that many Confederate soldiers laid down their arms and returned home to protect their farms. Liberated African Americans, on the other hand, proclaimed him as a second coming of Moses, a disciple of Lincoln, whom they referred to as a great Messiah, their personal savior. Brimming beneath the love, Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which set aside 400,000 acres of prime rice-growing land for the exclusive use of freedmen. By June of 1865, 40,000 freed blacks were lovingly cultivating what were known as Sherman's lands, falsely believing that the land would be theirs forever, as a belated repayment for generations of unpaid labor. After sparing Savannah, Sherman turned north, capturing Columbia, South Carolina, burning most of the city's businesses, churches, and wealthiest residential neighborhoods. The plan was to link up with Grant in Virginia in an attempt to finally corner the elusive Robert E. Lee. It would prove to be unnecessary. Faced with total warfare, 100,000 men deserted the Confederate armies. In a desperate attempt, Confederate forces offered freedom to black soldiers who fought for them on March 13th. Less than 1 month later, on April 9th, Grant cut off Lee's escape route into North Carolina, accepting his unconditional surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The two men knew each other well, and Grant set the stage for Reconstruction by accepting Lee's official surrender before then letting Lee go home on his horse in exchange for a promise that they would never again take up arms against the United States of America. 5 days earlier, Lincoln had visited the ruins of the Confederate capital. The city was still smoldering from Grant's attacks. Admiral David Porter was with the president on that fateful day, writing that no electric wire could have carried the news of the president's arrival sooner than it was circulated through Richmond. As far as the eye could see, the streets were alive with former slaves and poor whites rushing in our direction, and the crowd increased so fast that I had to surround the president with the sailors with fixed bayonets to keep them off. They all wanted to shake hands with Mr. Lincoln, or his coattail, or even to kneel down and kiss his boots. The Admiral continues, reflecting that I should have preferred to see the President of the United States entering the subjugated stronghold of the rebels with an escort more befitting his high station. Yet that would have looked as if he came as a conqueror to exult over a brave but fallen enemy. He came instead as a peacemaker, his hand extended to all who desired to take it. Less than a week later, Lincoln would be back in Washington, D.C., encouraging the nation to embrace normalcy once again by personally celebrating a date night with his wife at Ford's Theater. Believing that it was important to show the nation that peace had finally come, he publicly announced the performance that he was attending, leaving himself vulnerable to the machinations of Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln had won the Civil War, but the South was a scarred land, both from its past as well as its present state of affairs. The war for the South and its newly freed inhabitants was only just beginning.